He is a principal and a co-founder and currently chairman of his company, Neptune, including managing the company's performance assessment projects at government and commercial disposal sites. He has supported several initiatives with the national academies and IEA to consider alternative approaches to solving nuclear contamination problems. Paul earned his PhD in statistics and decision analysis from Carnegie Mellon. Now, while he's been suited up, Paul has also contributed significantly to the working group here, and he's a member of the steering committee as well. Paul, go ahead.
Oh, good afternoon. So I should, I guess, say, since we only put Neptune and Company up there as the authors of this, I had a lot of colleagues helping with this at Neptune. Maybe you know some of them. I could list a bunch of them. We always work as a collaborative team, which is fun anyway. So motivation for dealing with scaling. I know several from my perspective, and I'll get to what scaling really is. But Rob Schumann, who maybe some of you remember or know, he now lives as far east in the US as you can. But years ago, about 2008, maybe a little bit before, Rob gave a presentation on a PA that he'd done for LANL. And near the end of the presentation, he said, I just don't get this probabilistic stuff. My output, 5th to 95th percentile, is 8 orders of magnitude range. So I walked up to him after his presentation and say, Rob, this is because of scaling. You haven't scaled any of your input distributions. And if you don't do that and pay attention to scaling, that's the result. You end up with extremely wide output distributions. So scaling, I was thinking about Dave Esch's pyramid this morning and thinking that scaling actually sort of works up that pyramid. You get data at one scale, then you get process level models and abstractions, and then systems level models. And they're all at different scales. And if your input distributions don't reflect those scales, then what you're doing up here is usually not correct. You have a different scale for your data that represent often points in time and space, or not a whole lot more than that. And then at the top of the systems level, we're now modeling massive volumes over massive time frames. The distributions have to be different to reflect that. There's, I guess, one thing that I'll note while I'm saying that is one of the reasons for that, but it's not the only reason, is most of the modeling that we do, we pick a random number at the beginning of time and project it through time and space for that simulation. We're not picking a new random number every simulation. If we were, maybe I'd say this differently, but what I'd be saying instead is we should be doing what we're currently doing, picking a random number only at the beginning of time, but you have to use a statistical scaling process to get that distribution right. Otherwise, we run into computational complexity problems that are just unnecessary. Another reason this is important, and I'm a little reluctant to go here, but one of the reasons this is important is we're talking about upscaling. Climate change modeling does downscaling in space and upscaling in time, but it does some downscaling. There's some differences. Upscaling naturally reduces the range of a distribution. My reluctance here is we're not gaming the system, we're doing the right thing. And sometimes when we communicate narrowing ranges on distributions, somebody might argue that you're not accounting for all your uncertainty or you're gaming the system. That's not the intent at all. It's actually to get the system right. So years ago, when we started doing a PA at NTS, early 2000s, it was called NTS then, we ran a model, we didn't scale, we opened our eyes, started scaling, but I realized that after we'd finished all of that, had some nagging issues about how we were scaling and what was right and what was wrong. So what I'm going to try to do here is is present what scaling is and what are some of the problems associated with it. I put 4 examples in the paper as Ming introduced early on. There were papers by Roger, Craig Benson, and by me that are being produced through the P&RA community of practice. There's 4 simple examples in there that try to open our eyes. They're basically to do with eating M&Ms, driving to work, moisture content in the near surface at the Nevada test site, and plant root depths. They go through a range of examples because there's different challenges in each of them. I'm going to try to motivate this through driving to work. You can think about it as driving to dinner tonight if you like. A reason that this is also challenging is we've realized over time that most of our stakeholders don't get this either. So a reason for trying to come up with examples to explain this is to help communicate what the issue really is as well. And when you consider what Dave also said earlier, is that NRC evaluates these models in part by considering whether the upper uncertainty bound is crossing over some threshold. The last thing we need in our models is uncertainty that doesn't make sense because we got the scale wrong. So I'm saying all of that, and I realize in part that we have a community that's not necessarily fully sold on probabilistic modeling. You know, we've got lots of moving parts, which makes things awkward. We end up with output like this in probabilistic modeling. But I also realized, so putting this together, that NRC is pushing probabilistic modeling in their new reg. EPA is in 40 CFR 191 and 94 and 97. And DOE, maybe not. We've still got these hybrids, which I personally don't understand, but that's what we still have. PA models ultimately should also be embedded in a decision analysis that it helps us evaluate the consequence of actions that might be taken, evaluate different engineering designs, evaluate different institutional controls. What's the best option out of all of this? And my problem with not doing input distributions right is that as a consequence of it, I like to quote Charles Babbage on this. Charles Babbage is not quite the founder of the term, but he's the basis for the term garbage in, garbage out. When he's credited with inventing the first computer in the late 1800s. And in his book, he writes a passage that says, after I've invented my computer, I had people come up to me and say, if we give it the wrong numbers, can we get the right answers out? And his response, which I think is perfect, was, I fail to understand the confusion of ideas to lead somebody to even ask that question. And yet, that's what I find, that when we put these models together, we pay a heck of a lot more attention to the structure than we do to the specification. They're both important. They both need to be done as well as we can do them. So, driving my car to work. I look at the speedometer every now and then. I'm doing 75 miles an hour. Work is 15 miles from home. So if I got my calculations right, I'm going to get to work in 12 minutes. Bear in mind that I'm hypothetically doing a simulation here. And my data point from my distribution, my input distribution, if I don't scale, is 75 miles per hour. Some other times on my way to work, I'm doing 30 miles an hour. Now I'm going to get to work in what, half an hour? Other times I'm stopped at a traffic light. The good news for me is I'm never going to get to work in that simulation. So we have data for a specific variable, but we can't just simply apply the distribution of those data. And in a case like this, I'd hope that's obvious to everybody. It doesn't sometimes take me 12 minutes to get to work. It's never the case that I never get to work because I'm stuck at the traffic light all day long. These things don't happen. What happens is some form of scaling or averaging. Scaling is an averaging process. So what happens instead is, really I get to work in about 21 minutes every day. I have never got there in 12 minutes and never would. I'd be hitting all sorts of obstacles along the way. So in a modeling context, what we're interested in usually is the average or sum of effects across time and space. So how are we going to do this? Scaling is a statistical process, so we're going to apply statistics to it. And to do some of this research, we explored the literature and found hardly anything on this. There's something called stochastic averaging in another discipline, but it's about as close as it gets. So we were a little surprised that there was so little out there. But in principle, I can pick a random number from a momentary speed distribution at every time step. So maybe our time steps for driving to work are every 10 seconds or every minute or something like that. And we could pick a random number at every one of those time steps from the data distribution. Let's suppose my 75 miles per hour was me looking at my speedometer for 10 seconds. Yeah. There's a 10-second time step, if you like. I hope I don't really look at my speedometer for that long while I'm moving that fast. But you can pick a new random number every time step. So the question is, what's the equivalent procedure if instead all you do is pick a single random number at the beginning of time and apply that throughout time? And what does equivalence mean? Equivalence means we're running usually thousands of simulations. So what we're talking about is for process 1 and process 2, running 1,000 or more simulations in each one and getting the same result at the end of it. How do you do that? What input distribution do you need if you're only picking a random number at the beginning of time? So that's what we're talking about doing. So if we don't do it, we get some interesting bad decisions. I was thinking about that as I was coming over here, thinking that, heck, if I'm stuck at a traffic light and I'm not going to make it to work, I'm going to start making phone calls to people and say, I'm never going to get there. Start the meeting without me. Put somebody else in charge of it. You just make dumb decisions. So the decision context I was thinking about for driving to work was, how long before a 9 o'clock conference call or a meeting do I need to leave to go to work? Well, I told you all it takes me about 21 minutes to get there, so I'll leave 25 minutes before 9 o'clock. But if I don't do these distributions right, I'm going to leave at a completely different time. If I think I can get there in 12 minutes occasionally, I'll leave 15 minutes before work, and I'll miss my meeting. So, all right, so there's the scaling issue. Basic approach. Modeling should be based on what we think we know and how unsure we are about it. I'm not going to add conservatism to my model to get an answer that I want, which we also tend to do in this industry. So when I'm doing 75 miles per hour, I'm not going to call it 50 miles per hour just so I leave a little bit earlier to make sure I make the meeting. I want to model this properly and include not only get my probability distribution right, but get my value judgments right as well. Beth Moore asked about value judgments essentially earlier and how they're being handled in the DERAS project. But there's a way to handle them properly without having to weight them all the same. But values here that might matter to me is I want as much extra sleep in the morning as I can get, so I don't want to go to work too early. And I think, in principle, this is so obvious in terms of driving to work. This is how we all act usually. This is how we all think. We're not going to pretend that I might get to work in 12 minutes. We're not going to pretend that we might get to the restaurant tonight in 12 minutes. It's about the same distance. It's not going to happen, even if our speedometer happens to hit 75 miles an hour for a moment. It isn't going to happen. We all know that it's going to take about half an hour to get to the restaurant. So we're already scaling. We should be doing it in our models as well. So we set up an example to try to see what the impacts are of this. I have been over all of that. So 2 options: sample every year for 100 years, sample once with a 100-year average. 3 cases. We considered a linear response, a nonlinear response, and a multiplicative response. And the model we set up, because it's about as simple a transport model as we could do for a part of a PA, was let's just have some ants move some uranium directly to the surface. Ants actually mattered in Nevada. They were the most sensitive part of our transport model. So this isn't just sort of a joke to focus on ants. It actually mattered out there. So, you know, there's our basic ant model right there. So, and we chose U-238 because its half-life is so long that when we simulated this, that for 100 years there'd be no impact from it. So we've got a waste inventory, a nest density, a nest volume, lifespan of an ant colony, etc. So there's our basic model. For this exercise, we simplified it so that the only things we were going to vary were inventory, which is W, and X, which was nest density. So how many nests per unit area. We built the model in GoldSim, reproduced it in R, and we did the math. And we chose these simple cases because you can actually do the math. So, you know, there's a GoldSim model. There's the ant part of the GoldSim model, all the ant transports in there. Linear response. What happens with linear response, and to some extent why we might argue that we can get away with some of what we do, but if we have a linear and additive and stationary model, of course we have those all the time, right? Okay, if we have a linear additive stationary model, then simple averaging is the surrogate for scaling. Averaging works. The expectation's the same, the variance is the same. Doesn't matter whether you're using normal distributions or otherwise. This is just straight expectation and variance. This is straight statistical math. And so simple averaging works. There's the results from our ant model. Option 1 and option 2, where option 1 is choose a new random number every time step, and option 2 is simulate from the scaled distribution only at the beginning of time. And the results are identical. Okay? So then we thought, create a story and say that, you know, there's a lot of ant nests out there and they're competing a lot, so they're trying to do their best. So we're going to square the effect of having more ant nests out there. Obviously, we're just doing this to see what happens when you have a nonlinear function. So in this case, we get differences in the results if what you do is straight averaging. So if all you do is take the data distribution and essentially in a normal distribution context or central limit theorem context, you divide the standard deviation by the square root of n and now simulate from that from the beginning of time, you no longer get the same results. There is a way to get the same results. So here's the actual results from running option 1 and option 2, as they've been called here. And there's a difference. And obviously, you can now that there is a difference, you can make that difference artificially as large as you want to. This was just an example we ran with a normal distribution with a mean of 30 and a standard deviation of 5. So change the distribution. You can make these differences large if you want to. The point is there's a difference in both the mean and the variance. But you can fix this one. And this has always been the fix for this, I've always thought. We just never put the time and effort into thinking about it. But if expectation, if you know what the expectation operator is, but it's calculating the average of a process. If you take the expectation of the function of x instead of the function of the expectation of x, then you get the right answer. That's what stochastic averaging is in the context of the other areas that have actually looked at this a little bit. So that means that when we have a function like x squared in our model, what we should actually be doing is simulating x squared and then taking the expectation of that in order to simulate from the beginning of time. That fixes that problem. Now let's have another problem. Now we have a multiplicative model. I suppose it's multiplicative and nonlinear, but we're still claiming that it's stationary across time and space. So we'll assume that W and X are independent. W is inventory of uranium. We've just now made that a variable as well. And following the logic from previously, you'd like to think that the expectation of that function will work again, but it doesn't because there's two variables. So what does that mean? And this is where in the stochastic averaging world, what they started coming up with and saying is we can't get this exactly right, but there are approximations that work. So the outstanding question for us, we can still do E of f of x times E of g of w, which is still better than just doing straight averaging. But there's still things to think about, and what does this mean for NEPA if we're not doing this correctly? So the next steps for us are to, well, here's the difference in results in this case where there's nothing obvious that we can do about it. But there are approximations that can be applied. The difficulty with doing E of f of x or approximations to this is you're not going to do them within the modeling framework in which you're working, even if it's GoldSim. It's going to have to be done offline and then imported into GoldSim. So there's a question of how much difference does this really make, and is the difference worth having to go to the effort of doing this? But this corrects what is potentially a problem that could affect the way decisions are being made. So the effects could impact decision making. Scaling isn't always obvious. The plant root example I put into the paper, when we had that, we averaged over max plant root depth because it was a parameter in the model. And our roots, I don't know, the max depth ranged from near zero down to, I don't know, 10 meters or something. And by the time we averaged them, we had a distribution around 2 meters, and the waste started at 4 meters and down. So now we transported absolutely nothing through plants. So the point there being, you actually have to think about how to do scaling. And once we realized that problem, we actually did E of f of x and did it properly. It helped save a problem. It helped actually have plants transport radionuclides when they should have been. So scaling is not always obvious. It requires some thought to get it right. But it is something we should actually be doing. The impacts obviously depend on the relationship of the response and explanatory variables, the x's and the y's. We haven't tried other input distributions other than normal, but the basic statistical math, E and variance, expectation and variance applies anyway. We did actually apply this to a differential equation to an advection problem, but haven't put the results together yet. And we need to try larger models. And at the beginning I said that expectation works for scaling so long as you have a linear response, an additive model, and a stationary model. And we all have that all the time, or perhaps never. And our models are extremely complex. They're extremely multiplicative. They have high orders of exponents on various things like Van Genupton's equation and Millington quirk or whatever else we're using, tortuosity equations, etc. And so the question really is, given that level of complexity, what are we missing by not scaling, and how should we be doing the scaling as best we can? And maybe the stochastic averaging literature will help. We'll look at that next. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have time for one quick question before we open up the panel session. Anyone
have a
for
question.
Paul?
Yeah, main tips go
Yes,
on.
Steve.
Paul, you really started with a good philosophical thinking, and finally you came to some kind of a good, what needs to be done, good realization, and how it's related. For example, I just want your opinion. For example, if I'm looking for 1 out of 1 million or 1 out of 10 million versus 1 out of 10, I think if you give me some really good answers on 1 out of 1 million, where you risk and these things, if somebody asks me that what will happen 1 out of 10, I said, I'm almost 100% sure nothing will happen. You know, that's kind of thing. So question is, when you try to analyze our public, everybody asks, did you look at all the options, what's the uncertainty and those kind of things? It's always a big challenge, you know. You really come up with a really nice explanation about this driving and those kind of things. I really liked it. But you probably saw me how confident I am to predict 1 out of 10, because you did a very good whatever. You came up with some good realizations, 1 out of 1 million, okay? Mm-hmm. If 1 out of 1 million is only this one, so then I can very safely say to the public, what's the risk for these 10 people going close to the reactor? 0. Mm-hmm. You know? So it's really a become, from the communication part of, from the realization part of view, it's really a big challenge for the regulator. Anything you want to add to that?
There's several challenges here, and one of the challenges is just building reasonable distributions based on very poor information anyway, which is, I think, what you're essentially saying. And that's a reason why, while scaling is important and should be done, uncertainty has to be characterized as well as you can characterize it. And if that means you know nothing or very little, I don't want to say you know nothing, and maybe I'll come back to that, but you know very little, put a very wide distribution on it. And then that reflects your knowledge and how unsure you are. The reason I say you never know nothing is there was a book by Howard Rafer in 1968, I think, Decision Analysis. And in that book, he introduced the world to expert elicitation. And he runs an example in that book as a dialogue. It's so easy to read and get. But in that dialogue, the dialogue starts with his subject matter expert saying, I really don't know anything. And Rafer's response was, well, let me just ask you a few questions. And so actually in our company, I went through that a couple of years ago on, is Intel still in the audience too? Yeah, hey. I went through this a couple of years ago with erosion at West Valley, when one of my colleagues, who's an erosion expert, said, I really don't know anything about what's going on at West Valley with erosion. And we were out at lunch one day, and I said to him, well, let me ask you this. Do you think the site's going to erode within the next 1,000 years to expose some waste? And he said, I think I started with 10,000 years. And he said, yes, definitely. I said, how about 1,000 years? He said, yeah. How about 100 years? Well, maybe. He said, we've just elicited a distribution. Yeah, I need to do it a little more formally than that. But he didn't know nothing. He knows something. We always know something. The question is, how do you get it? How do you obtain that? And obtaining that information, if you have site-specific data, it's relatively easy. If you're relying on literature data, that's a pain in the neck because there's so many sources of uncertainty associated with using literature information. If you're going to use expert opinion, know how to do it. But there are methods for doing all of this. And so what still surprises me in this industry is, in this particular regard, is the lack of involvement of people who have the skills to actually do this. Instead, we're just putting distributions on things without really paying attention. And that continues. And we're reviewing another PA now where that's going on. And we're just looking at it saying, what's it going to take for somebody to pay attention? to avoid Babbage's garbage in, garbage out.